Morning, everyone. So just before the break, I'm going to talk about something everyone loves, which is regulation. I say that half jokingly and also in a half serious tone because there's a lot happening right now and the whole perspective in Europe is changing. And it's really going to radically affect how the entire field operates, we think, in the next 5-6 years. So I think Professor Karbowiak gave a nice introduction to why the regulation is starting to change. And I want to give an overview of just the big picture. I think many of you in the room are experts in individual pieces, and you could probably dive into the 50, 60 pages worth of documents on each one. But the goal here is to kind of show what's happening in a connected way across Europe and the landscape here. And we'll dive into 4 pieces of legislation that I think are most interesting and most changing right now and give some details. But the goal is not to get you lost in the details. So stick with me. We're almost at the break. And I think we'll be able to discuss more and see how these regulations affect everything else we do the next couple of days. So what catalyzed all of the changes that we're seeing now? And that's a big increase in public awareness. And I think you'll recognize these pictures and some of these points. In 2014, California and other jurisdictions started to apply restrictions on single-use plastic bags. Not soon after, I don't know how many of you have seen this video of a straw being pulled out of the sea turtle's nose. Do you recognize it? It has 100 million views. It went viral in 2015, and it kind of spurred this global awareness from the public about plastics in our oceans. And that was followed by the Blue Planet 2 documentary, which is narrated by the famous David Attenborough, which really put into picture for people what kind of effect food packaging is having on the environment, probably for the first time at that scale. And very importantly, just after that documentary came out, China publicly declared that it will no longer accept imports of foreign waste. And infrastructure in the US and EU were not prepared for that. We were reliant on sending all of our packaging waste, most of it, to Asia for them to recycle it. And no more is that an option. And other countries in Southeast Asia are following suit and applying similar restrictions. So now North America and Europe have to handle their recycling targets more or less on their own, or find other partners in other countries that are willing to take the waste, which, as you can guess, is problematic because many of them also don't have the infrastructure to handle the large volume of waste that we're producing and wanting to manage. So my presentation is going to kind of stem out from the European Green Deal. I'm sure most of you have heard about this. And circled in red are a few areas that we're going to talk about specifically. But the European Green Deal was kind of the EU's framework for transforming the entire economy in Europe. It has a target really on becoming carbon neutral by 2050, but it extends, as we'll see, far beyond just carbon emissions. We'll take a look at the Circular Economy Action Plan, the plastic strategy, which includes the Single-Use Plastics Directive that I'm sure you're familiar with, the farm-to-fork strategy that's supposed to address the entire chain of sustainable food systems in Europe, and then also the chemical strategy for sustainability that has a direct effect also on food contact materials, and the aim is to make chemicals across all of our products safer from the start. So looking on kind of these 3 frameworks in particular, the Circular Economy Action Plan includes this plastic strategy that has a single-use directive. We'll go into that one. That's one of our 4 topics we'll cover in more detail today. Most recent is the regulation on packaging and packaging waste. It's a proposal that's now up for public consultation, and it's going to have some serious shifts in how we look at recycling and reuse in Europe. The entire FCM framework regulation and the framework in general is now going under review. It's been ongoing for 3-4 years, and it's going to continue as we'll see there's delays. But there's some fundamental shifts they're thinking about in how to assess the safety of food contact materials going forward. And then the EU Chemical Strategy for Sustainability is kind of grappling with a few new concepts they're trying to implement across all chemicals regulations in the EU, especially trying to define essential use, what that means, what is safe and sustainable by design, and how do we implement that, and then how do we implement one substance, one assessment across all materials or all products so that a chemical is assessed once, and the outcomes of that assessment are applied everywhere without having what we have right now where REACH may not allow a chemical, but it's actually legally allowed to still be used in food contact materials. So diving into the first one, it's been around the longest, the first of the 4. This is the Single-Use Plastics Directive. It came into force officially in July 2021, and really simply, they being the European Commission, the European policymakers, targeted the 10 most littered single-use plastic products and decided to ban them from being placed on the market if there are sustainable alternatives available. And for the points here, you can see most of them, there are alternatives available. For FCMs in particular, we're talking about cutlery, plates, straws, and stirrers. And specifically, if made of expanded polystyrene, so styrofoam, food containers, beverage cups, and beverage containers are no longer allowed to be placed on the European market. It goes a bit further, and there was a big debate a few years ago about oxo-degradable plastics as being kind of a solution to address the problem. Those are banned now under the Single-Use Plastics Directive. It's no longer an alternative that can be used. Upcoming next, as a next step, in July 2024, you'll see bottles across the EU that have to have the lids attached to them to avoid that being a waste issue. And there's some very clear labeling requirements now for many products on exactly how they're supposed to be properly disposed by the consumer when the end of life is reached, including labeling the containers consistently so they know what product goes in which container everywhere across the EU. It also sets some very specific targets. We'll see that there's a few targets now for different types of FCMs across the regulations. And these are outlined for the ones within the Single-Use Plastics Directive. So there's a 77% collection target for plastic bottles by 2025. That goes up to 90% 4 years later. There's supposed to be a 25% recycled content in PET bottles by 2025, going up to 30% in all beverage bottles by 2030, which I think we hinted at a bit this morning with the challenge of, is there enough recycled plastics on the market to meet these targets? And under this directive, there's been ongoing work to publish rules and guidelines for how to track progress towards these targets so that the calculations are done in a standardized way by everyone. And then in addition, there is some discussion in the text about extended producer responsibility and about how producers are supposed to pay for waste collection, litter cleanup, and also awareness raising on how to manage end of life for some of the products that are here. Really important, and what differs this one from other things, is that this is a directive, not a regulation, which means that European member states have to transpose these rules into their national legislation, but then it's up to the member states on how to actually apply them. And we'll see that's different from some other things that are actually regulations, where word for word they have to be enforced in all the member states across the EU. Zooming in a bit now on chemicals, in October 2020, this is the second thing I think is important to talk about, is the chemical strategy for sustainability. So the overarching goal of this is just to prohibit the most harmful chemicals in all types of consumer products. It wants to address combination effects or mixtures of chemicals, because as we know, many chemicals act differently when they're in mixtures than when we're exposed individually to each one. And in the real world, we're not exposed to individual chemicals. We're always exposed to mixtures and products. And there's a discussion around making sure that the chemicals we do put on the market in our products are safe and sustainable by design. So from the very beginning, we know we're not going to have regrettable substitutions or find problems later that we have to withdraw products because there are hazards we didn't realize from the beginning. And there are working groups looking into each of these points to try and decide exactly how to implement these things across the European regulations that exist related to chemicals. Specifically for FCMs, in a communication on the strategy, there's a particular paragraph of text that outlines that food contact materials should not contain chemicals that cause cancer, gene mutations, affect the reproductive or endocrine system, or are persistent and bioaccumulative. So this is an ambition under the strategy that FCMs will not be allowed to have chemicals with these hazard properties. Point in case. It's not been implemented yet, but they're working on how to do that, and it's also linked to the revision of the entire FCM regulation in Europe. So at the Food Packaging Forum, we kind of asked ourselves, well, what exactly does that mean? Like, how many chemicals could this affect? And so we wanted to do a quick check. So I'll explain a little bit about what we did. We have a database we built based on over 60 different public lists and inventories from industry and regulators about all the chemicals used in different types of FCMs. There's over 12,000 of them that could be intentionally used, basically over the history of all time. And we compared those with hazard data from authoritative sources from ECHA, from the US EPA, from the globally harmonized system to try and match which of these hazards under the CSS should not be allowed in food contact materials. And what we found is that there are 388 chemicals that are known to potentially be used intentionally in FCMs that do have these hazard properties, and under the strategy should be entirely phased out and not allowed to be used. Most of them, as you can see, are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reprotoxic, CMRs. A few are EDCs. A few are persistent and bioaccumulative. And really also important to note is that about 20 of them are also monomers that were detected to migrate from the packaging into food or food simulant. And those monomers are hazardous and won't be allowed in the market if the Commission goes through with enforcing the rules they set here. And that includes styrene. We compared these 388 chemicals to all the different types of FCMs that they've been reported to maybe be used in. And on the right side of the screen, you can see what those are. So most of them show up, many of them, the most show up in printing inks, second to plastics, and then paper and board is not far behind plastics, and then coatings. And of course, these 352, many of them are used across different FCM types. So one hazardous chemical may show up in multiple places. We published this as an open access paper in the Journal of Hazardous Materials. There's a QR code here. You can go to the paper itself and download it. We have in the SI an Excel file that has the entire table of chemicals and all the hazard data that's linked to it. And so you can filter and play around with the data yourself to see what's most interesting for you. There's a lot of different processes within the CSS that are ongoing that all affect FCMs in different ways. And you've probably heard of a couple of these, and I can't go into detail about all of them by any means. But REACH is the European Chemicals Regulation. There's big pressure right now to entirely revise it. It's been seen as insufficient in terms of enforcement and enforcing that the data is complete. So there's a group working on this, and we're waiting to see if REACH will be revised. Implementing the one substance, one assessment approach is being discussed. The classification, labeling, and packaging regulation is also being revised, and there's now a requirement to identify and label endocrine disruptors on the packaging of products. The safe and sustainable by design is being discussed. There's a lot of discussion around essential use with PFAS, the perfluorinated compounds, serving as kind of the poster child of this movement to decide where is PFAS actually essential to be used and where should it be phased out entirely. And that's going to set precedent for how this entire discussion about what is essential goes forward in products in the future. Okay, the next one, entirely switching now. This is looking at food contact legislation across Europe. I'll tell the story a little bit of the background, which maybe helps to understand why they started to think about changing the current regulations and where it's going. So in 2016, the European Parliament published a report that said that current FCM safety evaluation is inefficient and it needs to be reviewed. They tasked DG Sante, which is part of the Commission, to in 2018 start evaluating current laws and decide if they're fit for purpose. They carried out lots of consultations, lots of multiple workshops with stakeholders. They targeted stakeholders individually to discuss their concerns. They had an evaluation report, there was an impact assessment, lots of steps happened, and in the end, kind of the summary of what they found was, overall, the efficiency of the FCM legislation appears to be suboptimal in Europe. That's kind of the neutral, political, formal summary of saying there's things that need to be improved. And these are the things that they identified as some of the biggest issues to be improved in the current regulation. And I think this really reflects concerns from industry, it reflects concerns from consumer organizations and from governments. There's a lack of harmonized rules across Europe for many food packaging types. We talk about plastics a lot. Plastics has by far the most regulation. EU 10/2011, There's positive lists, negative lists, monomers, but for paper and board, there's really no guidance on how to apply safety across all FCMs that are used in Europe. There's a lack of focus on the final article. There's many checks on the input, but not so much on what actually is the final article safety. There's a lack of transparency across actors in the supply chain to ensure compliance. Lots of confidential business information that people don't want to share downstream, or it's really a burden to get from people above you. And frankly, there's been seen to be a poor enforcement of the rules that are already there, and the Commission's, many say, is understaffed. National authorities don't have the resources they need to enforce the complexity of the rules that are on the table currently. And this is also a big challenge for SMEs that don't have entire legal departments to try and keep track of the changes and ensure that their companies are compliant. So the way they're trying to address this is by considering a potential revision of the entire FCM framework in Europe. There's working groups within the Commission that involve some stakeholders that are now considering this. They have slides that are public online. You can scan the QR code here. It should bring you to the Commission page that publishes the outputs from every meeting. But really fundamental here is a shift from the input to the final materials. In an example of what they're considering, none of this is final yet, this is all kind of internal brainstorming that they're going to work towards a proposal, is they were looking at grouping specific materials to have different requirements for each material type. So right now what they've outlined is that synthetic organic materials, plastics, rubbers, coatings, there will be a required assessment of the final product, which means that manufacturers of the material will be responsible for knowing every chemical in the final product that can migrate into food. They will not differentiate anymore between intentionally added and non-intentionally added. It will be the responsibility of the manufacturer to know everything in the material. And that's a big shift from what we've seen so far, where we have positive lists and we're just approving what can go in from the beginning. You'll have to now check and make sure what comes out at the end is also compliant. And then for natural organic materials and wood, they're proposing potentially a less strict approach where there is a positive list. For inorganic materials that don't have as much migration in general, they're going to maybe consider just putting specific migration limits on metals. And then for special materials, which affects this session here, recycled, active, they're saying, well, we might have to have special rules here because they're complex. So we may have to combine different approaches to appropriately address these special materials that require a bit more treatment. They're also looking at prioritizing the chemicals differently that are used in FCMs. So they're proposing the same thing, kind of a tiered approach based on the hazards. Under the CSS, like we talked about before, CMRs, EDCs, PBTs are all to be not allowed anymore in FCMs. But other substances of concern may be risk assessed by competent authorities instead of just being banned before they can be used. Some examples they gave of this are neurotoxins, immunotoxins, nanoforms. And then more benign substances will also have to be risk assessed, but instead that can be done by the operators or the manufacturers directly without having to involve the government. And then there's a huge discussion around how do we improve information collection and that make the transport of information across all the different suppliers and stakeholders in the supply chain easier. And they're looking at the digital ways of doing this. They're proposing potentially centralized databases, QR codes. It's all kind of being discussed internally as how we can make it feasible for people to implement while keeping track of information across all the different steps. Next steps here are that DG Sante has to finalize an impact assessment and identify policy options, which are kind of roughly one of two options might come out of this. The first is that they'll just do a targeted revision of the current framework as it is, maybe take some pieces of it and change it, or they're going to propose an entire new legal framework from the ground up kind of that changes the approach using some of the ideas that were on the previous two slides. This is a story of delays. We started this process in 2016. There was supposed to be a proposal from the Commission for new regulation in 2022. Then we heard it was 2023. Now we hear it's 2025 at the earliest. And we're waiting for a working paper to come out from this working group at the end of 2023, they say. So keep your eyes open for this. We're kind of just waiting to see what they do and asking them to move forward. There's no formal deadline. This is an ordinary process, so discussions continue until there's an agreement between all the internal commission people and the parliament and the council involved. There's going to be a change of government in 2024. New commissioners will come in. There's a potential those new commissioners will have different priorities, which means this entire process may get further delayed. So that's something to note when making plans. Okay, changing gears, last one. So this is the most recent FCM-related regulation called the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation. It originally came out in 1994. Similar background story in 2020. There was impact assessment to determine how effective the current packaging and packaging waste regulation is. They did targeted stakeholder consultations, they held public consultations, and just like the FCM revision, they came to a conclusion that the current rules there don't adequately address the problems that we have. And that includes that there's growing packaging waste generation, like we saw in the previous presentation. There's recycling targets that member states are not reaching. There's a lot of barriers to packaging, recycling, and reuse actually taking form on the market. And then there's issues of low quality in plastic packaging and the use of secondary raw materials on the market. So to address this, they came out this time now with a full proposal. It's a very long 50, 60-page document with annexes and detailed outlines of how this new regulation is going to look and what requirements it's going to set. Important to note here is this is a regulation, not a directive. So more or less word for word, what's written in the EU document has to be applied by all the EU member states directly. They provide 3 policy options in their proposal, and there's one in particular that sets mandatory targets for reducing waste overall, for enforcing reuse in certain food sectors, and then having minimum recycled content in plastic packaging. And the big shift I think here to see is that this is really promoting the hierarchy we all learned in elementary school, which is first you're supposed to reduce, then reuse, and as a final option, recycle. And that we're going to see in targets that they've set in this proposal. So these are details about some of the reduction and mandatory recycling targets. By end of 2025, 65% by weight of all packaging waste should be recycled, and it's detailed specifically 50% of plastic, 50% of aluminum, 70% of glass, and 75% of paper and board. By 2029, there should be return schemes for metal and single-use plastic beverage containers across the EU. And then overall, there should be a per capita reduction of packaging waste that increases in steps up to 2040 compared to 2018 levels. So it's not just about recycling more or reusing more, it's about using less. And this is also a big shift we're seeing in how they're thinking about the long-term view of handling waste in Europe. It also sets these specific reuse and refill targets by 2030 for different food sectors. 10% of non-alcoholic beverages should have reuse systems that increases to 25% by 2040. Hot and cold takeaway beverage containers should have 20% by 2030. It goes up to 80% by 2040. And then restaurants and cafes, and then wine, and except sparkling wine also has some specific targets. And there's a lot more details in this regulation about end-of-life labeling and all packaging items. I encourage you to take a look at the text in detail if you want to understand all the things in play there. Next steps, importantly to note, this does not include health and safety. This falls under the FCM revision from DG Sante. This is really just about waste management, more or less, packaging waste. There's currently a feedback period that's open until April. There's ongoing delays with translating it into all the EU languages, so they keep pushing the consultation back a bit, but I think probably now until middle or end of April, you can submit comments on this proposal yourself as an individual or as an organization. And then the European Parliament and Council have to review it and agree. Same thing, there's no hard deadlines here. discussions continue until everyone agrees that it's where it needs to be. Those were 4 of what we see as the biggest kind of European-wide policy initiatives happening. But don't forget about national ones. There's lots and lots of national regulations and initiatives that are coming and have come over the past few years, specifically related to FCMs. These are just a couple examples. Spain passed a law about packaging targets, which included reuse in some grocery stores. France is very active, specifically regarding endocrine disrupting chemicals and setting reuse targets. And most recently, there is a restriction from member states in the EU to ban the use of all perfluorinated substances across all sectors, with very few exceptions. And there's an entirely separate process ongoing there to get feedback. And it's going to go through the entire ECHA process with having the 2 committees review the proposal, and they're also accepting comments. So the comment period will open, I think, in the coming weeks, if not already now. So if you're interested in PFAS, there's a chance for you to give input here and to follow along with what's happening. And then, zooming out even further, don't forget about the UN, which has a plastics treaty that they're negotiating right now. The next meeting is in May in Paris. That has the potential to set targets worldwide for how we manage plastics. And then there's a separate panel on science policy for chemicals and waste, which could also affect things like mixture toxicity, endocrine disruption, hazard classes, and making sure that the science gets into the policymakers' hands when making decisions. Those are all QR codes, and the slides are online, so if you want to look into them, you can open the slides right now from the fitness website and then dive into the details yourself. On that note, I'll stop lecturing you on regulatory details and just say that if you're interested in following some of these updates, we at the Food Packaging Forum spend a lot of our time just reading publications from governments and industry and civil society organizations to summarize what's happening and get kind of the knowledge out there to people. We have free daily news, we have fact sheets, dossiers on different scientific topics, a newsletter you can subscribe to. You can search by keyword. I don't know how many thousands of articles we have just kind of documenting what's happened over the past decade in the field. And if you can't find something you're looking for, send us an email, and we'll be happy to try and point you at least towards the right direction and who you could talk to if we can't give you details ourselves. And on that note, thanks for your attention, and I look forward to the discussions later today.
Do you have some insight regarding what is going on paper and board? Tough question. No, briefly.
So we know that the Commission, I think that's the biggest, one of the biggest areas of complaint with the lack of harmonized rules in Europe is for paper and board, that there's nothing. And so the industry associations have had to step in and try and stitch together recommendations from national associations or member states on how to ensure safety under the framework regulation. I haven't heard specifics about what the Commission's thinking about. I mean, but we know that from the working group slides that they put out the past 2 months, that they're looking at prioritizing paper and board as one of these materials that need to be risk assessed really thoroughly in the final article. And it's still kind of anyone's guess exactly what that's going to look like or what that's going to entail. And frankly, there's the risk that the Commission decides that they're not going to try and change anything. You know, so we're kind of in the dark, and everyone I've talked to who's in touch with the Commission doesn't really get much more information from them right now. It's all kind of ambiguous, but I think if anything happens, that's going to be a key focus point.
Yeah, I think so too, because, and you touched the point, because the perfluor substances now is, of course, as you said, they are environmentally spread, let's say, and that means that they are being phased out in many applications, as well as in food packaging. But on the other side, there is this demand for better properties on paper and paperboard. So, yeah, thank you very much. I think it's, we will be waiting for what is coming from the...
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an important point with paper and board, is that there's a big push right now with the single-use plastics restriction to switch everything to paper and board. But from what we've seen looking at the data, I mean, paper and board is just behind plastics on the diversity of chemicals that migrate. And there's not harmonized regulation to ensure that those are being tracked. And so I think we need to be really careful before we just move everything to paper and board, because there's lots of safety checks that need to be done better before we can do that.
We will address these later today
Yeah.
as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks.